And welcome to the Unknown Webcast. Where are you at here? Oh, here I am. Welcome to the Unknown Webcast. Sorry, I got a little distracted because our Facebook is not working. I need to go and fix that. In the meantime, though, just to alert you, welcome to the Unknown Webcast. This is just a bit of a trigger warning for those who believe words are more injurious than sticks and stones. I really am so conservative, I can't turn left even when I'm driving. In addition to giving trigger warnings to our viewers, Ron Hensel and I both drink coffee for your protection. This week, Anthony Costello joins us to respond to the question. It's not a question, actually, it's an assertion: the return of paganism. My name is Don Vino. I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast, and our senior researcher is Ron Hensel, who will introduce the sponsors of today's webcast. And here is Ronnie Baby.
Greetings from sunny Florida, although it's a little bit nippy, but it's still kind of sunny. Down here where the palm tree saw its shadow, and now we have 12 more months of summer. Our sponsor of this edition of the Unknown Webcast is Retouched by an Angel, a new revelation every week. Check local listings for details. Retouched by an Angel. Our regular legal disclaimer: our guest on today's webcast, insert name here, that would be Anthony Costello, has no connection whatsoever to any of the satirical content of the Unknown Webcast, hereafter referred to as the webcast, although he probably will not mention it again. This satirical content includes any and all commercials, end credits, puns, smart remarks, or anything else that might fall under the definition of satire. In the meantime, Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. bears no liability for or responsibility for anyone's opinions regarding this satirical content. Notice: the opinions expressed in this webcast are ours and should be yours too. If you enjoy it, or if it really annoys you and you just want to inflict it on someone else to ensure your continued access, please go to midwestoutreach.org, click the yellow donate button, and contribute as you feel led. And as you do, never fear, this webcast is Y2K compliant. And don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite video channels. And now our special guest, very special guest, Anthony Costello. I hope you understand the complete sincerity of the applause here in my hand. So, greetings, Anthony.
Oh, thanks, Don and Ron. That's certainly the best introduction I've had in several weeks, at least.
Okay. Well, not that we are out to compete with others' introductions.
Yeah.
But just explain to us later why we didn't win.
Yeah.
So
no, I appreciate you guys. Appreciate you guys reaching out and asking me to come on the podcast today. So it's good.
Well,
to be
you've done some articles, and you did a booklet that is handled by Ratio Christie, titled "The Return of Paganism," which, as you might be aware and cover our discussions here, is something that is important to me, sort of near and dear to my heart, if you will. And my friend Carl Tykrib and I and there's about a dozen of us that do things like going to Paganicon each year, and the Parliament of World Religions and other issues like that. And in like Paganicon, we discovered a very high percentage of those who were involved in paganism there were raised from Christian churches and left, which brings me to a kind of interesting statistics here. In 2017, Barna and Summit Ministries did some research and discovered that only 17% of Christians actually have a biblical worldview. And it has decreased since then. In 2021, it went down to 9%. Now, why is that? Well, in part, it could be this. In 2022, Barna's research discovered that 37%, only 37% of Christian pastors in the U.S. have a biblical worldview. That's going to have some play in this whole big question of the paganization of culture. And Alan Watts had written that for a new decade is seeing a remarkable revival of interest in magic, witchcraft, alchemy, astrology, and mythology, which is invading even the universities and creating the suspicion that the worldview of modern science may itself have been a peculiar form of myth.
Yes.
Interesting statement.
Right.
And one other is Dr. Morris Berman. The only hope, or so it seems to me, lies in re-enchantment of the world. In other words, a repaganization.
Yeah.
Now, as you mentioned when we were before we started, it seems like it all happened quickly, but this has actually been in the works for a long time. I often have said to people that it only feels like it's quick because you just noticed it. In reality, it took the church 300 years to transform civilization into Western culture as we know it today. The pagans have taken the last 200 years to return the favor.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think that's right. And I think if we, and I just want to say too, in advance to the audience here that, I'm also, I'd say, I kind of want to say friendly with Carl. Carl Teichrob has been a great interlocutor that we've had on our own podcast now several times. We've never actually met in person, but Carl is also somebody who's been sort of on this topic of the repaganization of society and the move towards one world religiosity under a one world government for quite some time now. And it's been, I've learned a lot from Carl and I've read his book, Game of God. So I also want to, if people aren't aware of Carl's work on this, he's another great resource to go to. But yeah, Don, I think, you read a couple quotes there, I think maybe from some contemporary authors, writers,
Right.
thinkers, but we could go back. I started off my lecture on this with T.S. Eliot, the great poet and English literary figure who is giving a series of lectures at Cambridge University in the late 1930s, just before the outbreak of World War II, where Eliot is saying basically the Western world is at a turning point. It's at a point of confrontation, and either and this is these lectures went on to get put into a book called which you can find called The Idea of a Christian Society or Christianity and Culture. And he says the West is at a turning point, and the turning point has we either can go have a revivification, a revival of the Christian worldview and the Christian society, or the West is going to just revert back to what it was prior to the Christian global mission, to a pagan culture, right? And practice and pagan practice and belief. And he called that living in he called it living in the neutral world. He thought we were in a neutral place. The 1930s Britain, the English speaking world in Europe was not yet anti-Christian, but it wasn't really Christian either. It was just sort of in a neutral kind of holding pattern. And he really thought then that there was a choice that the West was going to have to make. And Chesterton said things a few generation prior, and then of course C.S. Lewis drew this out in several of his works, most poignantly in Abolition of Man, and in the Space Trilogy, right, which some of your audience might be familiar with. So these thinkers were already seeing the writing on the wall. Now I would say probably the origins of the neo-pagan movement go back even further, right around the time of the Enlightenment. You already have responses to the Enlightenment thinkers some of the Enlightenment philosophers who think that the project of the natural sciences will sort of be the the salvation for men. This is where we're going to get real knowledge. This is and then the project of science, theoretical science that leads to technology, will then, through our creation and use of technology, we'll be able to liberate ourselves from all of the trappings of what ancient men used to call sin or whatever.
Let me break your thought there one moment
Yep.
for a very quick question.
Yep.
Believing friend asked, is this the Anthony Costello who was with Warrior Saint Ministries?
No, that's not familiar to me. That must have been a different Anthony
Okay,
Costello.
good.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyways, you get something like in the late 18th and early 19th century, you get like the German Romantic movement with a capital R. And you get guys like Goethe, Schiller, these poets, literary figures and everything. And they're very much into already rejecting sort of this idea of science, what later we would call scientism, right? That science is and logic and just reason alone is the sort of the gateway to our collective human future, or some kind of universal salvation. And they're saying, no, we sort of need not Christianity or even the theistic religions. We need spirituality, right? We need the spiritual component that is common to us all. And of course, these guys like Schiller, or in England, Shelley and Wordsworth and some of the other poets, Blake, what they wanted was this middle point between, they didn't want, the shackles of what they called revealed religion, right? Because revealed religion, the Judeo-Christian tradition, comes, of course, with the moral law, and the moral law, we certainly don't like being under that. But we want the religious experience. We want sort of
So what they're looking for is kind of like a first century Gnosticism, first through third century Gnosticism, where knowledge is sort of an inner knowingness that is not objectively verifiable.
Yeah, and maybe also where nature itself is sort of imbued with its own divine presence and power. So a form of pantheism.
Yeah.
Right, where nature is divine. So on any pagan worldview, and that's all the worldviews that the Bible talks about in the Old Testament. What is the religion of the nations? This is paganism. This is just what almost every, I mean, there might be an occasional outlier, but it'd be very rare. But every pre-Christian global mission, right? I'm talking about the global mission of the church that goes out, first, to Jerusalem, Judea, then through the Roman Empire to the ends of the world, through then the colonialism and so on and so forth. Every pre-global Christian mission is a form of pagan belief and practice, right? So that just is the religion of the nations prior to the Christian revelation claim. So these 19th and 18th and 19th century Romantics, they wanted to hold on to some kind of what we might call today spiritual but not religious, worldview, where yes, there's sort of a Gnostic component there, and for them it's the artist, right? It's the poet who is sort of this I think in Shelley's term, the unacknowledged legislator of cultural morality, because the poet or the artist is the one that can tap into this sort of realm of nature, this mysterious realm of nature, and then articulate to the culture, what God is really like. But again, this is at the same time a clear and explicit rejection of the Christian revelation claim as found in the scripture, and then what they would have called something like churchianity or something, the traditions of the church. Yeah. So it's there. I think where we felt like the turn came quickly, even though it was always there, we made the mistake of thinking that a very sort of particular kind of atheistic materialism was the real boogeyman on the block. And secularization meant this kind of very strict atheistic materialism. Where we made the mistake there is we did have a sort of heyday of very prominent figures in philosophy, in science. This was kind of the route the philosophical departments took in America, Canada, and the English-speaking world, this analytic tradition, right, of sort of the Bertrand Russell types and his successors with the logical positivists of the 1950s and 60s that were where we get this sort of idea of scientism, this positivism that through the natural sciences, we will exhaustively sort of explain reality to the world. And then again, develop the requisite technologies that we need to make our short, brutish lives livable until maybe 80 or 90 years old. And then we'll just disintegrate back into this impersonal stuff of matter in motion. But that was not really the case in the popular culture. In the popular culture, everybody's still very spiritual, even if not religious in the traditional sense.
Right. Well, that's well said. And the church, as you and I know, the church is, since the first century, has been in trouble. This is kind of not a new thing. Well, for example, and when I point this out, when I teach on this, I point out that the Gospel of John, in fact, I think all except one, maybe Philemon, of the books in the New Testament, in some areas are written to refute false teachers, false teachings, bad behavior, lay down correct doctrine, and good behavior, pretty much all the way through. The Gospel of John is no different. He starts off refuting Docetism and Ebionites in the very first 5 words.
Yeah.
And he goes from there. And then everything else that follows tells us the story of Jesus' life and ministry with a particular bent. Each one is to demonstrate he's a physical being. He's not a ghost, a phantasm. Right? He's going to be crucified physically. He's going to be raised physically. He's really there. And he pre-existed creation. Those things are all the way through the Gospel of John. So they had the same issues really in the first century that we have today.
I always emphasize with my students, and I just teach at a little church in LA County, California, and I always emphasize to my students, because they don't have formal education, they don't know, necessarily a lot of history and everything, but I remind them, from using the phrase from the book of Ecclesiastes, there is nothing new under the sun. I mean, we're always going to be sort of dealing with some form of early heresy that has been renamed and repackaged, but that basically has the same features, the same fundamental tenets that are being proposed. So, you might think it could look at, there is a sense of a neo-pagan world being kind of a very scary thing, because we have a precedent of what pagan societies look like in history. And they're not very pretty, and they're not very gracious, and they're not very loving, and they're not very peaceful. And a young guy by the name of John Daniel Davidson, who is a Catholic author, but the book doesn't really focus on that too much, like that the fact that he's Catholic, but he wrote a good book called Pagan America that just came out last year. And his thesis, and I think it's fairly correct and accurate, is that where he just goes back and he says, look at what pagan societies in the past looked like,
right?
Especially with regards to law and governance. Right? I mean, we have still in our institutions of law and governance are based on a Judeo-Christian
worldview,
theological worldview. And in Davidson's book, he's talking about what is it already looking like the more the culture becomes spiritually paganized, what kinds of laws and what kinds of governing strategies are emerging out of that. And that can be a very scary and daunting thing. But as you point out, but this is what the early church was dealing with. They were in Rome, right?
Yeah.
They were preaching to Romans and Greeks who worshiped pagan gods and who had a state that also assumed paganism as the religious basis for its
And you're
issuing
right,
of laws.
including worship of the emperor.
Worship, including worship of the state and embodied in the emperor. Exactly.
Right.
So we do have resources available to us. I would encourage all our brothers and sisters in Christ, as we are studying the scriptures, to also recapture or take another look at how the early church was reading the scriptures, because they were dealing with the kinds of people, beliefs, and practices that we're probably going to be running into more and more, that we're going to be engaging with more and more as well.
Right. It is interesting. And Tom Holland, in his book Dominion, he just does a bang up job. I mean, he was mystified. He was like one of the atheists.
Yeah,
one of the
yeah,
big
Tom
atheists
Holland,
guys,
yeah.
right? And he's also a historian. And so as he started doing his research, he started discovering, to his chagrin, that if it had not been for Christianity, you would not have Western culture. Period. You wouldn't even have the opportunity to have wokeism, because that you have to have this
that's a good
right
point.
kind of
Yeah.
country. Yeah.
Well, you wouldn't have science in its present state either. You would not have the
Correct.
natural sciences. We just did an interview with Dr. John Bloom from Biola University on this. You would not have the natural sciences in the way we have them in that whole project
Right.
of the natural sciences in the West, because there was a presupposition that the God of nature was a God of order, and
Right.
not a pagan God of caprice and
chaos.
that was almost like just a personification of a human person with all its vices, with all our vices and whims and whimsies and so on and so forth.
Now we have a question that you may or may not have an answer for. I do not, but it has to do with someone by the name of Billy Carson.
Yeah.
I don't believe the lies of Billy Carson, and I want to hear some actual facts.
Well, boy, I am so glad this question got asked, because I am friends, and I can say that, I think, genuinely, with Wesley Huff. I met Wesley Huff about 8 years ago at a ministry event, met him again at the Evangelical Theological Society conference in 2023 in San Antonio. We did a podcast with Wesley Huff before the Billy Carson event occurred. Wes Huff is
back up for everyone else, because you and Cosmic Seas know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
The rest of the world doesn't.
Okay, so I did not know who Billy Carson was at all until my friend, who's an apologist up in Canada and a New Testament scholar, specifically he's doing his research in New Testament textual criticism. His name's Wesley Huff. Somehow, back in November, Billy Carson apparently is some big online internet YouTube influencer, but he's a total like conspiracy theorist kook. And I think I use that word correctly here, who has no knowledge of church history, no knowledge of biblical history, just is not a scholar in any way, shape, or form. And my friend Wesley Huff from Apologetics Canada somehow got invited onto another podcast. The podcaster was a friend of Billy Carson's, and he had Wes Huff come on the podcast, and they had a debate. And I mean, Wes didn't even have to prepare for this debate. Wes is in a dissertation phase on textual criticism. He's been doing New Testament studies for like 10 years. And he just exposed this Billy Carson as the total huckster, shuckster, whatever, snake oilman that he is. I mean, it's embarrassing, to the point where Billy Carson tried to sue Wes Huff and his friend, this guy who I don't know who had live streamed the podcast. And now Wes has been on several channels. He's getting millions of views. Our podcast with Wes, we re-released it. And I would suggest watch our podcast at the Kirkwood Center for Theology and Ethics with Wesley Huff on Who Wrote the Gospels, if you just want to get a taste of some of the work that Wes is doing. But yeah, Billy Carson is just a joke. This is like conspiracy theory level Bible, talk. So it's good that he got exposed, and it's good that my friend did it. Yeah.
Right. So it's not just that you have different views that can be argued through in a debate kind of format. he just is off the reservation.
Yeah, it's just not. I mean, I don't know all the ins and outs of it. I mean, I would certainly watch the debate with Wes against Billy Carson. It's online, and now Wes has been on several channels, so you can just watch any of Wes's interviews. But really, this is just a question of New Testament scholarship. I mean, this guy was so off the ranch and had no clue about where any New Testament scholar, whether it's evangelical or Roman Catholic. I mean, it's just this Billy Carson had no clue of what he was talking about, and he was peddling stuff that I think, as far as I know, it's just because it gets views. It sounds Gnostic, right? I mean, this is sort of he was sort of kind of like the gospel of Jesus's wife, type guy.
Oh
these
my,
late,
okay.
and then they were just. So I don't know all the ins and out of it, but definitely just look up some of Wes Huff's material. Watch the debate that Wes did with Billy Carson, and watch some of our videos with Wes, and that'll start to clear up for you. I think some of the lies or just bad scholarship that this guy was trying to put out there.
Great question, Cosmic Seeds, and hopefully a good answer. We're talking with Anthony Costello about his book, The Return of Paganism. And it is clearly returning. And I'm glad we got the opportunity to do this because, unfortunately, much of the church doesn't realize it, and it isn't even creeping into the church.
Yes. Oh, yes, it is.
Right. I mean, you talked about it just went out of my brain. Worldview. God is pantheism.
Pantheism, yes.
Right. Panentheism has made good headways in many evangelical churches through the Enneagram.
Okay, I didn't know that Enneagram and panentheism were connected, but Enneagram is certainly a problem. Yeah.
Enneagram is panentheistic at its core. Richard Rohr has been clear about that. And he's kind of trained the ones who are the key writers with all of the evangelical publishers promoting this stuff. And so the whole goal of the Enneagram is very simple to understand. You have never been separated from God. You just created a false self that thinks you're separated from God. And so you have to figure out which of the 9 paths is your path to get back to the realization that you have always been with God, and then reconnect with your true unsinful self.
Yeah. So this, I didn't know. I knew the Enneagram was bad news. I want to say its originator was maybe even a practicing pagan. I don't know, but I don't know enough about it.
In fact, if you send me an address, I'll send you our book on it.
Okay. Yeah. Good. I'm glad you guys wrote something on that. I mean, I did see it pop up occasionally around here, and I never took a serious look at it. So this probably is more a form of Gnosticism. It sounds very much almost like Plotinus's Neoplatonism that emerged in the 3rd century, and that has always sort of caused problems for Christians trying to synthesize biblical revelation with Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism holds a sort of panentheistic worldview where there's a hierarchy of being, right? And God is sort of like emanated throughout creation.
Right.
So in some very real sense, we are all part of God, even though as opposed to pantheism, on panentheism, the Godhead is still sort of transcendent to the rest of creation, but the line starts to get very blurry on panentheism, and so it's always a danger there.
Well, okay,
and so this gets recapitulated later in medieval. Just to make this last point, in Jewish Kabbalah, which maybe but it's always making a comeback, and it's very dangerous, I would say.
Well, I like the way that Peter Jones has put this, and it being Carl, he brings this up a lot. There's a difference between oneism and twoism. Everything is God, or God is separate from creation. That's twoism, and interacts with creation. And panentheism, God is bigger than the universe, but the universe is his body, is in and through
somehow.
everything. Yeah, exactly. So,
And one other thing to point out on that, liberal or progressive Christianity or theology, which is, again, is always has this sort of Gnostic flavor to it, like Richard Rohr. On these views, this is a point that Richard Niebuhr pointed out years ago in his book, Christ and Culture, when he talked about the Christ of culture Christian. On this view, what happens is the central conflict, theological, ontological conflict, is shifted from a conflict between God and man, that there's an ontological and moral rupture between us and God, to there being a rupture between us and nature.
right.
We're okay. God and on these views, it's like us and God we're just fine. We're good. We're copacetic. But what we have a problem with is fallen nature. And we have to figure out ways to sort of overcome our human nature.
Right.
Or either, our own human nature or the nature that's out there. And the way that we often do that is through our own artifice, through our own techne. Then we use technology and so on and so forth, or through sort of these spiritual technologies of getting in touch with our true selves. Because again, we're okay with God, and on a lot of these views, Jesus gets reduced down to something like a moral exemplar.
Yeah.
He's not the God-man who comes to repair the rift between us and the Father. He's a moral example for us how we should live together in this sort of somewhat broken creation.
He's the way shower, not the way.
Right.
Yeah. Now, we are going to take just a short break because we have a sponsor that wants us to hear from them.
Yes, because, Cynthia's life is in crisis. She doesn't know if she can believe she's a sinner. How will she break the news to her parole officer? Jacob is in shock. His pastor laughed when he suggested he might be the reincarnation of Elvis. Will he ever find a church that supports his spiritual views? Charity is engaged to Brad, who is already married to Betsy. That won't be a problem in Brad's and Betsy's polygamous cult, but Charity wonders how all this will work out in the afterlife. All these people have one thing in common. They're all looking for a gospel that's been retouched by an angel. If your gospel bothers you, have it retouched with a new revelation every week. Consult your local listings for details. Retouched by an angel. So, you want to check into that? We all have to find.
I just hope people understand that this is satirical. I fear these days some people might.
Well, we had that disclaimer at the beginning, so.
Right.
That's like with the Babylon Bee when it first came. Like, I hope people understand that these things are satire.
It's actually more fun when they don't. So
exactly. I mean, I get stuff from we were doing this way before Babylon Bee was even
before you guys. Yeah.
Our early website, Ron had put up something, World's End Theology Outlet.
Oh, we still use them.
Yeah,
and so we had like Bill Gothard's Umbrellas of Protection, and we know
still have a commercial for that. Yeah,
that's good stuff. That's good.
Yeah.
Got to put those creative talents to good use.
Yeah.
Well, some things I think call out to be ridiculed.
Yeah. I mean, Jesus ridicules some folks.
He does. Someone had pointed out that there are 6 types of satire, 5 of which are found in Scripture.
Yeah.
So, when people kind of get on us, and occasionally they do, I say, your problem's really not with us. Your problem's with the Bible. God used satire.
I think Elijah had a few things to say to the prophets of Baal that were.
He definitely did. And like, okay, there's this guy who has a tree, cuts it down, cuts it into 3 parts. One part he heats himself with, one part he cooks his dinner with, one part he falls down and worship and says, "Deliver me." That's satire. So, all right. So a question comes to the fore. Brooklyn Lou the Skeptic asks, didn't Judaism emerge from paganism prior to Old Testament being written?
Well, that's a huge question. I'm not an Old Testament scholar or historian, but what I would say is I think everybody agrees that the very first chapter of the Bible is a polemic against paganism.
Right.
I mean, I'll even side shelf who wrote Genesis. I mean, I still hold to some kind of I hold to a Mosaic authorship of some type. But even if you want to posit that it's some Mosaic scribes or whatever your view is, I mean, I think every Old Testament scholar that I've run across, Jewish and Christian alike, would say that Genesis 1 right out the bat is offering a counter argument to the whole pagan worldview. That's just, so the very first chapter of the Bible, and everybody I think also agrees that Genesis is still the oldest book of the Bible historically, is a polemic against paganism.
It is.
Yeah.
But how did it evolve? Abraham, for example.
Yeah, well, there's a calling out.
He wasn't
Jewish.
Yeah,
sure. Right. No, right. I mean, if you want, yeah. As far as like the Israelites, that they were called out of paganism. Yeah. I mean, so here's one thing, what we might say is, I think I kind of mentioned this earlier. It does seem to me that after the fall, the default religious worldview of ancient peoples is some kind of pantheistic paganism. And then that has to be, God reveals to Abraham, and then through Moses and the Israelites, he reveals the fact of the matter.
And we can see, even in the story of Genesis, we can see that early on, they had the right knowledge of God, but rejected it. We see that happening at the Tower of Babel, for example. We don't really like what God's saying, so we're going to build a monument to ourselves, a tower to ourselves.
Yeah, right.
And declare ourselves to be God, basically. So that battle has gone on almost since the beginning.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's true. I think look, I kind of, as I've been researching this and now writing more for the next book, or the bigger version of the book, you have like kind of two options, metaphysically speaking. You have sort of the oneism that you used Peter Jones's term. In technical terms, we would call it like metaphysical monism or something, substance monism. There's only one thing. It's all divine. It's all God. Now, for the pagan, that means an eternal, uncreated creation, what we would call creation. So this is what Paul's talking about in Romans 1:18-32, that our tendency is to collapse creator and creation into one thing. And then we worship aspects of the creation. That's what he's saying there. And that, prior to God's revelation to special revelation, right, that this is what kind of human beings naturally do, is we conflate creation and creator. So, yeah, I mean, were the Israelites called out of some kind of paganism, starting with Abraham? Yeah, for sure. And on that note, they had to be called out again after the Exodus from Egypt, because after 400 years in slavery in a pagan nation, they had to be weaned in the desert off of falling back into this conception of Yahweh as some kind of local deity, right? So one of the things I don't talk about in the book, but I wrote a long article on this that has been read a lot, is like, why was Moses not allowed to go into the promised land? And a lot of times we're because he got angry, or he didn't, there's a good argument that the reason Moses was prevented from entering into the promised land after striking the rock at Meribah was because the way he did that, and where he uses the term "shall we," meaning him and Aaron, draw the water out of the rock for you, you rebellious children of Israel. When he says we, he's placing the locus of power on himself. As if him and Aaron are almost like now Egyptian magicians. And we can talk about magic in a second, who, in virtue of doing the right sort of incantation and the right sort of movement, boom, and then the water springs out of this rock. And God is upset, not because I don't think because Moses got angry. He's upset because Moses starts to elevate himself as the source of the miracle. And in doing so, demotes Yahweh. Because when it comes to magic is the forcing of the God to do what you want the God to do. Right? If you say the right incantation, if you make the right moves, then the God is forced to respond.
Right.
And this is exactly what God is saying. I mean, the Israelites had 400 years of that. The Egyptian magicians did recreate some of those miracles. 4, I think, that they were able to recreate. 3 or 4.
Right.
So, so God is trying to wean the Israelites off of out of paganism yet again. And here goes Moses off, and he kind of, does this thing which doesn't help that.
Well, and that is, again, now we mentioned that the church has always been problems. There've always been heresy.
Yeah.
Same thing with the nation of Israel. He kept sending the prophets. Why? Because they kept slipping back into worshiping idols, false gods, false deities. That's a problem. When Jesus came, I have suggested, we've written about this, that Jesus came as a missionary to the household of faith. Why? Because they had lost the essential elements of their relationship with God. Yeah, some of them were pretty orthodox in keeping the law per se, but they somehow believed that is what saved them and brought them status before God. Others, you had other views going on within Judaism. Jesus incarnates and he comes to say, okay, all y'all need to repent.
Yeah. Well, and here's something as I was reading through some of the JPS commentaries on the Torah, there are similarities between pagan religions and Judaism and Christianity because there's general revelation as well. And the pagan nations did get some things right through the common grace and looking at the creation and saying, pondering about the creation. So you even get some pagan cultures where you'd say like they even look like maybe they got a little bit closer to truth than other pagan nations, right? Like the Aztecs were pretty far away from getting general revelation. But you read like Confucius or the Analects, and you're like, the reason that God gave him in the general revelation of nature and the common grace, Confucius got a few things right. Aristotle got maybe a couple things that looked a little bit closer to the truth than some of these other nations. So we do see some overlap between paganism and Judaism and Christianity, to be sure. But one thing that seems to be totally missing in any pagan religion is the idea of repentance, that there's a moral law, that God is righteous, right? And that there is a moral law, and we've broken the moral law, and we're in need of repentance before God. That seems to be missing completely. There's atonement, there's propitiation, there's sacrifice, but there's not that sense of repentance.
Right. So Brooklyn Lou, the skeptic, says, appreciate your answers. Makes sense. When God speaks about other gods like Baal, he was speaking about gods that did not exist. The answer is correct.
Well, this is maybe where I don't, Don, and we haven't talked about this. Anyway, we were talking about Michael Heiser's book. So, what certainly is the case is the idols, the images,
were not gods.
Are just as the prophets say, they're dead wood, stone, and metal.
Were there demonic forces behind those? And I think, yeah.
Yeah, I'd say yes. I think however want to parse out the term Elohim in the Old Testament, the early church fathers, from Justin Martyr and the early apologists on through, I'm in the middle of Tertullian now, they would say that, like the prophets, that the stone, the wood, the images that are created by the metal worker. These are just, dead objects, but that's unclean spirits, demons, whatever you want to, Elohim, that they use, or they use that these objects to compel or influence false worship and false belief.
Right. Right. Completely. So you were on the same page on that.
Yeah.
Regardless of where we may disagree about Michael Heiser.
On Michael Heiser's specific work on that.
Yeah.
But I think we agree that these entities exist.
Absolutely.
Now they're created, they're derivative, they're finite. They are not co-eternal, they're not co-equal, right? But we see the Satan going back and forth in Job, and I think we can take those immaterial beings. I would say we call them immaterial beings, like the human soul is immaterial. But they're moral agents. They're not like principle, like numbers or something. And they have causal powers. They can cause things to happen in a limited way.
Right. And so that kind of goes to this next question. When it says gods, it's not the same as idols. Is that correct? Or are those gods and idols the same thing? The answer is, in my opinion, the idols are representative of the demonic forces at work at the time.
Right.
Right.
And then I wrote an article about artificial intelligence and the demonic, because we're seeing a lot of really grotesque and horrible things happen through human beings interfacing with artificial intelligence.
Right.
So you could kind of think, if you want to think of like the stone object that was carved into the form of or the golden calf, whatever, which breaks the second commandment. If you don't want to think in those sort of more ancient terms of like an object of stone, maybe we need to start thinking about the objects that we interface with on a regular basis. It's all techne at the end of the day. It's all things that we've made or carved out or manipulated with our own ingenuity and hands, and that, and whether or not, something similar or analogous can be going on with the type of things that we have in front of us and that we're bowing down to on a daily basis.
It might help if we work backwards a little bit. The Bible is very clear that there's one true God who created all things that came into existence. He himself is not created. He always exists. He's infinite and eternal. So there's a definite difference, but that's why we call it twoism. God is separate from creation, although he interacts with creation. The second level then is you have spiritual beings that are fallen. We would call them demonic, spiritual beings that rebelled against God. They too interact with this world in various ways. The idols they may work with represent them in a sense, but the idol is nothing. Paul says that in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, God says that. Give up on it. It's not even live. It can't deliver you. It can't do anything for you. But it can mess up your life.
Right.
Because of the evil forces behind it.
Yeah. 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 And then, of course, we would also say that there are angelic beings who serve God. We know that in virtue of the angel Gabriel, for example. So, but of course, what the Bible also tells us, whenever one of those angels appears, we're never to fall down and worship it, right? And the angel will usually say, don't, get up, John, but yeah, so we have created immaterial spirit beings, right? And the technical term for God's eternity is aseity. God is ase. God is uncreated. God is eternal. The creation is not eternal. And for the pagan, and I think this is going to be the case either for the ancient or the neo-pagan, the modern pagan, they almost need the universe to be eternal. The hinge of the pagan ontology is the eternality of nature itself. So there's no such thing. There cannot be creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothing, on a pagan worldview.
Right. Right.
And that's
right.
where we can employ some of our apologetic arguments for the finitude of the universe, the cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument, so on and so forth. If we are engaging at that level with the pagan, at that level of more natural theology and so an argument. Yeah.
So I want to answer Brooklyn's one question here, and then we can move on to a couple other things.
Sure.
He says, "I love your honest approach. One thing I cannot get is that a real God, all caps, would pay attention and speak about fake gods. Just seems odd to me. Now, it would seem odd to you if you thought God didn't actually care about his creation. Then it would seem odd. God speaks about false gods because he does not want his creation to be deceived by the false gods."
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I agree. It's an interesting question. I haven't thought about that much. I mean, I don't, God might even still care in some way for these other spirit beings. I don't know. The Bible doesn't say everything about these beings.
No,
Um,
no, but it says enough to say, okay, those who rebelled will be eternally condemned.
Condemned.
The
And
2/3 that did not,
yeah,
of course, will be with God forever.
right. And and God is certainly warning us. So, I mean, throughout the Bible, I mean, if there's one thing that is throughout the Bible is that God is warning us not to bow down or worship or get involved with
Or
these
get
other
involved.
creatures.
Follow, be deceived by.
And that's where the neo-pagan, I mean, we could talk about like from like more contemporary manifestations, examples of neo-paganism, witchcraft, occult practice, and so on and so forth. You are getting involved.
Right.
You're getting involved with these creatures that are doomed for hell. And they're doomed for hell for good reason, because they are in rebellion against God, and they want to destroy, manipulate, deceive, harm, hurt God's creation, of which you are part.
So this book is an important one. It's not very long, and it can be helpful for those who don't know as much about this, The Return of Paganism. It is a growing issue. It is becoming more people are becoming more aware of it now, and that's why it feels like it happened quickly. I had someone, I just spoke at a conference not that long ago where someone came up, they couldn't figure out where CRT, how that all came on us so quickly, for example. And I said, it didn't come in quickly.
Yeah.
They said, what do you mean? I said, okay, think about it this way. If you go to a play and you're sitting in your seats waiting for it to begin, you might notice the curtains are moving a little bit. What you don't think about is the play was written a long time ago. It was then kind of smoothed through. They brought in actors and they started preparing for it. They built the sets. There was a lot of work that went on in advance of your arriving at the theater, and then the curtains parted one day. What you're seeing is the curtains parting.
Yeah.
All of this has been in process for a long time, and culture has been prepared to accept it and embrace it, which is why we're so shocked, because those who are kind of going along with their regular lives in a somewhat Judeo-Christian worldview suddenly are seeing this kind of every place.
Yeah.
It's shocking to them.
Your audience might be familiar with Francis Schaeffer.
Yeah.
I named my second son Schaeffer after Francis Schaeffer. Francis Schaeffer really put his finger on how worldviews sort of disseminate through culture, right? And he has this step-by-step process where it starts in some, philosophy department somewhere, and then it works its way into the popular culture. And before you know it, it's in your art, it's in your entertainment. And he always says, and theology, the theologians in the church are always like the last ones to figure out that this is going on. And then we all start to try react to it, although it's been there for quite some time. I like the theater analogy. I think that's a good way of putting it. A recent book that really does a great job of illustrating the intellectual history of all the wokeness and everything was Carl Trueman's recent book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self.
Right.
So we recommend that too.
Right. Well, something you talk about the universities, which is a quote we started off with, Alan Watts. He
Yeah.
pointed out that the witchcraft, alchemy, astrology, and mythology, which is invading even the universities.
So I have a friend and colleague, I think I called him friend a couple times, Owen Anderson at Arizona State University, and he is fighting. He's a Reformed theologian, but professor of theology, philosophy at Arizona State. He's fighting this exact battle,
right?
Because there is goddess. There are prayers to the goddess in faculty meetings that he's noted. There's been presentations to students about the benefits of witchcraft and magical healing, and so on and so forth. Yet when he wants to teach an intro to Christianity seminar, he gets like pounced on by the powers that be. So on campuses right now, spirituality, but not religious. This is very big. This is big. And I think Satan and his minions know that in the West, at least, the way to, and Francis Schaeffer pointed this out, the way into a culture is through the institutions of education.
Yes. Yeah. Well, that was even true in the, I would say in the first century.
Yes, it was.
Paul, it's interesting that Paul went to the big cities to plant churches and proclaim the gospels. We rarely see him going to like, Podunk Little, wherever. Not that it isn't important, but the thought centers, that's what it is, of culture,
Corinth,
become permeated with this stuff. And then it goes from there through trade and other ways across their trade routes. The universities act that way today.
I wrote in an article once, I was referencing back to Julian the Apostate, who was
absolutely
the emperor after Constantinus II, who was a Arian Christian at least, but Julian was a full-on pagan. We need to return Rome to its pagan roots. And the first thing he did is he kicked all of the Christians out of the academies. They couldn't teach at the academies anymore. So he understood that as well.
Right. And it's an important thing. That is the thought shapers of culture. So our thought shapers of culture are the university, our quote news outlets. They shape how we think about the world. And Christians need to be articulate and engaged at that level, I would suggest.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying proclaiming the gospel from the pulpit is a bad thing. I think that can be helpful. But the church itself is supposed to be an embassy where we disciple believers and train believers. If unbelievers come in, they should be welcome. Certainly, that's what Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 14. But the primary object of that setting is not evangelism.
Yes.
It is preparing believers to do what? Out there in the marketplace of ideas to confront culture with the gospel.
Yeah, and I grew up Roman Catholic, so preaching was a little bit different, so I didn't live through the seeker sensitive movement of the 1980s and 90s where
I did.
Yeah, you guys did, and seemed like one main feature of that was like you have to give this very basic evangelistic presentation every Sunday, from the pulpit, but then everybody who's there who's already a born again believer,
pretty much
kind of just like, okay, like, can we get to the meat and leave the milk, the milk behind? And I've run into this problem a lot, I think, where, and God bless this. I mean, I'm thinking of people who are just, the most devoted Christian men and women, prayer warriors, absolutely just, love the Lord, but they've not been fed in any significant way to deal with the culture that they're living in.
Well, my wife and I had gone to Willow Creek for a short time after sort of a bad church experience. And then they opened one in Lombard. They didn't, but another church was similar thing. And we went there and we thought, well, this is kind of weak. I mean, the pastor only really had 3 sermons that he did repeatedly week after week after week. But we thought, okay, it's a place where we can take unbelievers to, and at least they'll hear the gospel.
Yeah.
But an interesting thing happened after about, I don't know, 8 months or so. The younger college age students and young and under would come to Joy and I and say, could you start a study where we could start learning stuff about the Bible? Because they were not getting it at church, and they were trying to reach their friends outside the church, and they didn't have the tools to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when I got saved at 34. I was in the military, and I just had a religion. I saw Jesus; He saved me, and then it was game on from there. Just reading Bible, everything, But I do remember it, and I've loved most of the churches I've been to. So I don't want to, one of the first churches that I was at, here's a bunch of adults doing Bible study, and we're getting these little what would you call them, like study courses that would come with a booklet, usually from Saddleback or something, and they're like fill in the
blanks, right?
5th grade level reading material,
right?
Like Jesus blanks you,
right?
Loves, It's like, I mean, it's like, and these are adults, these are professional. I mean, it's like, can we go a little bit deeper than this?
Well, my home church, our pastor has what we call Wonder Lake Bible Institute, and he, over a 5-year period, he's going to take you through the core things you might get at a Bible college. And he does it every Sunday morning before church. We're also putting together a thing where quarterly, probably, what are we going to call it? Questionable. We're going to call it questionable. An opportunity just to open the doors one evening or after church, come in, ask all your questions, just like we're doing here. And let's get it, because questions, I love questions. I think questions are so cool, and you should be able to ask them. Too many churches are not equipped to deal with that.
Well, and I think now we have a generation of knowledge about this sort of stereotypical young evangelical kid who was just told, this is what we do, this is what we believe. And then he goes off to college,
right? Or
he's already in his 30s and 40s, and he's maybe like a worship leader or something.
Right.
And he reads some book by Bart Ehrman for the first time or something. And his whole worldview just collapses. And he's maybe in a ministry position or something
or by Richard Rohr, the worship leader that had been at Rob Bell's church, went to Willow Creek, and one of the first things he did on his personal pages started raving about Richard Rohr's works and how they have revolutionized his understanding of Christianity. Well, they would, because it's not Christianity.
Right. And I studied under Fred Sanders, who's one of the best Trinitarian scholars we have in the country right now.
Yeah.
And I mean, he's written response to Richard Rohr, but Richard Rohr is popular, and Fred Sanders is just a starving academic at the end of the day. Yeah. But we're going to
have to go. I do want people to again know about this book. I think it's an important one to pick up and read. The Return of Paganism. Everything old is new again. Anthony Costello, and you can get that at the website for Ratio Christi, which is the link is in the description below. You can get that. And we're going to have you back in the future, by the way.
Great. Yeah, it's been great to be here. I appreciate hanging out.
Ron, would you walk us out of here?
Let's give credit to whom credit is due. Our resident cult leader profiler is Neil before me. Our wardrobe manager is See How It Fits You. Culinary services are provided by Chef Ham and Cheese. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Just in Case. Jehovah's Witnesses coverage comes from Armageddon and The Opposer. Our Mormon archives manager is Polygamous. Our liberal denominations bureau chief is Lucy Goosey. Our transgender issues coverage comes from Ben Hur. Special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys, Ode to Humanity. Our fact-check supervisor is Joe Bulling. Our technical assistance comes through Mercury Research. Our legal advisors are at the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham & Howe. Our grievance resolution director is Giovanna Pisami. Our director of privacy assurance is Wayne Tapping. And original idea sourcing comes from Drew A. Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, both of whom are solely responsible for this content, although you will never be able to prove that in a court of law.
Never happen.
No.
All right, Anthony, If you can hold on for a minute, everyone else, we will see you next week all of a sudden.